Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Wednesday Summit podcast. We're into the early 30s now, and the number of podcasts that we've done here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. And I have, as you can see, a number of gentlemen with me today who, if you're a fan of the podcast, you certainly recognize them all. They've been here numerous times, and they were gracious enough to come back yet again today. I especially want to thank Rob Huffman for supplying the material for today's foray into Ed Wood. And we're going to talk about, first off, I want to say we're not speculating. Very often we speculate on whether we think something might or might not be Ed Wood. We know this is an actual Ed Wood paperback that we're going to talk about today, so that speculation is entirely off the table. It's Toni. I often call it mistakenly Toni Black Empress, but it's actually Toni Black TIGRESS from 1969, private editions, paperback from 1969. Quite rare, fairly obscure, doesn't turn up much on auction. I don't know a whole ton of people actually who have a copy of it, although I do know that of the four of us sitting here in the room right now, there are two people present who have physical copies of it, and perhaps they'll tell you a little bit more about that. Obviously, Rob, since he supplied the imaging for this for the four of us, he does have a copy, and Joe or Jim may want to tell you which one of the two of the. Oh, I think Jim gave it away. Jim gave it away. All right, so Jim has a copy of Toni as well. I had a copy of Toni actually lent to me back in 2016 or so. A reader of the Ed Wood Wednesdays portion of Joe's wonderful Dead Rights blog sent a copy to me, and I kept it for about a month or so and read through it 2 or 3 times, and I'll hold my tongue as far as what my opinion was. Many years later, just recently, I had the pleasure of reading it yet again. So that's what we're going to talk about, and there's a lot to talk about. So I'll get out of the way here and toss it over if you want to say a few opening words and anything by way of an introduction. Rob.
Hey, thanks for having me, and let me join the panel, even though I don't have a biblical name. Wanted to just flash the original there. As you see, it's a remaindered copy, and I think copies that you've seen on sale on eBay are also remaindered because they never show the front cover. And I think Jim's was a little more brittle. You can see, I think even my first page has been scored by a box cutter, so it was a little difficult to take pictures of. But I was glad I was able to share it with you all so we could talk about it.
Cool. Well, thanks, Rob. How about let's toss it over, Jim.
Yeah, it's I spaced off. I'd have to go run to get mine. Mine still has the full front cover, and it's in fairly good shape. It hasn't been. There's no remainder cut marks or punch outs to it or anything like that. I picked it up. My brain is just going. I picked it up within this last year off of eBay by somebody who I think didn't quite realize what they had. Because on the one hand, they had it priced for buy it now for $80, which was just insane and actually had me wondering if I was actually going to be getting the book they had pictured or if they were just using a stock photo and I was going to get something in really bad shape, but it turned out to be in pretty good shape.
And surprisingly, I got this one for half that. So I think someone else, but it's got Ed Wood Jr. on the cover. It's not something, it's not Dick Trent. So it's right. I'm surprised. I think it's just not a very well-known text. Maybe it's a little transgressive. I don't, it might not be for everybody, but.
And then since then, there's now a copy that's been up there for a while that somebody's asking over $700 for, which I'm sure will sit there for a very long time.
Right.
Yeah, there's just a picture of the back cover. That's it.
Which makes you wonder what the front looks like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, for $700, you better have like about a dozen photos of that book up there showing the condition.
Yeah. Somebody eventually will go for it. They're being very patient. Obviously, if they lowered it down to $300 or $400, they'd probably be able to sell it relatively quickly. But I wish them luck selling it for nearly $800. You paid, I think you made an offer and paid something like $70, right? Like,
yeah, I think it was like 75 or 80 all told.
That's incredible. That's incredible, right?
Which is,
really
I mean, that was like so lucky it's not even funny because
Right, right. Cool. Well, thank you. And Joe, the proprietor of the Dead, I want to shout out Dead to Rights blog, obviously the
thank
home of
you.
Edward Wednesdays. I wouldn't be here today if not for the Edward Wednesdays portion of the Dead to Rights blog, of course.
Well, I'm happy to be here on the panel. I am desperately trying to keep Edward Wednesdays alive. I've been trying to put out at least something every single week this in the year 2023, even though I don't have as much time for this stuff. I want to take this opportunity to say, if you have emailed me or messaged me about anything Ed Wood related in the last 4 or 5 months, and I have not gotten back to you, it's because I just don't have as much time to devote to Ed Wood as I once did. So I'm sorry for that. You're maybe try again. I don't know. But I was glad to be here on this panel because this kind of forced me to spend some time reading an Ed Wood novel and thinking about the content in it and thinking about how I want to talk about it. So thank you for this opportunity. It kind of disciplined me to be back on the Ed Wood thing. So yeah, I'm just excited to talk about the book today.
Cool. That's a good word too, Joe. Discipline, right? I've lost the discipline of writing articles at Edward Wednesdays, and I certainly want to try to rediscipline or find my motivation to a greater degree. So yeah, when I hear you say that, a little bit of a dagger in my heart because I've not contributed often of late, and I want to. I certainly want to. So it reminds me. I'm very busy too with a lot of other things, but it reminds me that this I have obviously more fun doing than fucking around with all kinds of other nonsense in my goddamn life. So that being said, so let's start with a quick, if anybody want to volunteer to give us a quick summary of there's a lot of characters, obviously, but the actual through line of the narrative is pretty straightforward. Anybody want to toss in a quick summary?
Hey, Greg, before we dive in, could we talk about the name Toni and
we can
Ed's
start
use
there.
of that name
Absolutely.
in several places.
Absolutely, we can start there. So yeah, go ahead.
All right. Well, it appears in lots of his work. Probably most known by everyone is the Apostolov films, and there could kind of be a loose connection made to like cocktail hostesses because of the name of the character and the occupation, but it's used all over in his work. Some of the books I haven't read, but I picked up on them anyway. There's also Toni, also played by Renee Bond, both in Cocktail Hostesses and in Fugitive Girls. Her character's name is Toni. So we have the same actors playing two different Tonis in two different films. But the short story Out of the Fog has a Toni in it. The Witches of Amal Ra, I don't know how to pronounce that, has a Toni in it. And then we have male Tonys with a Y that become Tonys with an I. And there is another Toni, and It Takes One to Know One, and The Gay Underworld. If I might have missed a couple.
Well, one of Ed's lifelong, or at least career-long obsessions is names that have that can be masculine or feminine, or names that have masculine versions and feminine versions. So so a name like Toni, Tony, and Toni, Toni, would very much appeal to him. I don't know why that was such an obsession with his career long, but it's something that he keeps coming back to over and over and over again. If you watch The Violent Years, all the female gang members have names that can easily be turned into male names. I'm not. You'd think though that in his entire career there Wenas or something, but there's not. He doesn't really do a lot of female versions of Ed. The closest that we get, I think that in one of the books somewhere, there's a character named Junior who goes by a male character named Junior who goes by June, So that's how he turned his own name into a female name. So Toni is a name that would very much appeal to him. So because of the title of this thing, I kept thinking of Toni the Tiger from Frosted Flakes. So that obviously doesn't turn out to be that doesn't have any connection to this book at all. I don't know if that was maybe in Ed's mind somewhere, this Toni the Tiger and Toni Black Tigress. But what surprised me about this book, I don't know, the title and then like the cover blurb, because you scanned not only the text of the book, but also like the back cover and the hype type sort of stuff at the beginning of the book as well. It set me up for a very, very different kind of book than what we were going to get. I thought we were going to get like basically a Pam Grier movie in text form where Toni is this badass with a rifle and she's like taking down Whitey and burning down the ghetto, and the novel is not like that at all. It's not even close. And I'm not even sure that I would call Toni a tigress in that sense. She does have some expertise with a rifle, and she uses it very prominently near the end of the book. But Cleopatra Jones or something, she ain't. So that's not what this book is at all. So I was dumbfounded by what the direction that this book actually goes. So I thought this was going to be like a badass Black female heroine, sort of presaging the blaxploitation era, but that's not what Toni Black Tigress is at all. So
I actually thought, Joe, and I was going to pose this question since you already sort of opened the door for this question. To a degree, is it a bit of a coming of age story in its own weird way? I mean, that of course, really in a really weird way, actually, it would be.
Yeah.
Obviously. So there's another Toni as well, Rob, and in a book that has not been yet revealed to be an actual authentic Ed Wood paperback. Jim, of course, knows exactly what I'm talking about because it was a discovery of his, and perhaps at some point, I'm hoping before the end of the year, we'll be back and we'll talk about that one as well. So yes, his work is rife with Tonys. That being said, I will toss it over to Jim. You gave a little bit, I think, of a sense of what the purported narrative of the book is, Joe, and then if we dig one layer deeper, of course, which we're about to do. But go ahead, Jim, and by way of any where you want to go with the conversation.
Well, since we started talking about the name Toni, I would just, so I read all of Ed's novels quite a few years ago, and at the time I read them purely for enjoyment. And sitting down to read Toni Black Tigress now very analytically and stumbling across things that I see or imagine in it as, made me think I really need to go back and revisit all of Ed's novels again with a much more analytical frame of mind. On, where names are concerned, this book has some strange names that have resonances that I cannot believe are coincidental. So we start off, the first person we're introduced to is this very masculine butch lesbian Uncle Kieran. Well, a Kieran or a Keelan in Chinese and Japanese mythology is this mythical beast that's a mixture of male and female and acts as a what's the word I'm looking for? They're a herald for the arrival of someone important. So before we meet the main character, Toni, we have this androgynous herald who introduces us to Toni. I thought that was very strange. Then we meet Preacher Rael, R-A-L-E. Well, and of course, now as we'll come to know in the book, he's this false preacher who's just, he's selling people this bogus message. And in medical terms, Rael, R-A-L-E, is the sound you hear in a stethoscope from diseased lungs. It's a diseased noise. It's a noise of indicating corruption in the body. And then I have to just go to some notes here because it was actually too much to remember. And then the other thing that struck me where the names were concerned was the highest level member of the organization that we meet, Prince Haka, who is, his job is he travels around the country doing the org's work. Haka is a Chinese word for a traveler or a sojourner. And in the book, Prince Haka wears a turban, and it's said late in the book that he lives in this palatial house in the San Bernardino Mountains. Well, let me find my note here. Yeah, so right in the middle of the San Bernardino Mountains is a town called Crestline that has a huge mountain that overlooks a valley. And there were palatial residences on that mountain. And one of them was owned by a turban in the 30s and through the 50s, was owned by a turban wearing Sikh cult leader. He was actually, he was born a Sikh, but he became a Christian. So it was actually a Christian cult in that area in the 30s through 50s, a guy by the name of Prince Akmoy Kumar Mazumdar. So, you know, I'm finding this just way too coincidental that Ed is invoking these names and invokes this idea of this turban wearing guy living in a palace on a mountainside, you know, in the San Bernardino Mountains. I think Ed was drawing on things that he knew about. And so there are these little Easter eggs in the book. And that's what made me think, gosh, you know, if I went back and if I revisited his other works with a much more analytical frame of mind, what other little things would crop up in there? I'm not claiming some grand meaning for all of this, but in the same way that there were things that that showed up in, darn it, what was the last book we did? Help me, Greg.
Black Myth.
Thank you. In the same way that there were some odd things showing up in Black Myth that for the content of the book did not need to be there. You know, I think Ed is pulling some other things in that, you know, are interesting little Easter eggs.
Indeed, that's great. That's fascinating, actually. Real quick, you both of you mentioned the organization, so take one step back just for context. The narrative of the book is Toni is being sort of brought into the organization as a teenager. Eventually, she becomes a quote-unquote whore for the organization, and beyond that, I don't want to give away the latter part of the plot. Exactly at this point, but what is the organization, real quick? Essentially, book is set in contemporary times, so it was published in 1969. He certainly wrote it shortly prior to that because he does reference the Watts riots as having been quote unquote 3 years ago in the narrative. So the organization is kind of a black power group with its own hierarchy, and yes, Prince Haka at the top level of what we see of the hierarchy, at least in the book. But Preacher Rail is actually Preacher Rail is playing a game, right? He's sort of on the MLK front saying not nonviolence. He's quote unquote preaching nonviolence, but he's doing it deliberately to attract followers and make them loyal so that ultimately they can be deployed in a violent way. So he among all the other folks in the hierarchy of the organization, of course, are corrupt. I think Rail, the fact that you tied that together, Jim, is spot on. It makes total sense to me that Ed would have been very deliberate in picking that name. He's not only corrupt, but he's a sociopath, beyond a sociopath. One other thought, and then I'll try to step out of the way, but there's in today's nomenclature, you would call it gender fluidity, perhaps, but in the book, men dress as women, women dress as men. Ed himself will refer to characters at one point or another along the way as a he or a she, and so he's technically, is he perhaps misgendering people in today's nomenclature?
Well,
so go ahead, Joe.
Well, okay, I think he does this sometimes as a reveal or like a little twist, like with Uncle Kieran. I think Uncle Kieran is like the first character that we get to meet, and I think the revelation that is actually female is meant to be like a shocking twisteroo at the end of chapter 1. Right. And as I was reading this, these you have the nonviolent Black leader, Reverend, the preacher Rail, and then you have the more militant Black leader, Scat Blue. And I thought of them as being Ed's very grotesque parodies of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, respectively. And Ed is sort of a conspiracy theorist throughout this book, and it's that both these guys who seemingly have opposite views, they're all working for the same organization, and it's all this big conspiracy. And we've talked about Prince Haka, but I think there's the implication that there are people like even higher up, and that this goes all the way to the top, and that this is some kind of conspiracy that reaches all the way to the top levels of government in Washington. So, and that they're all sort of puppets to this organization. And so we get the strata of people involved in this conspiracy. This he thinks of the entire civil rights movement basically as a big conspiracy with these con men and people at different levels. And you see people being fed from one, and our heroine, for lack of a better term, Toni, is this young woman who gets recruited into the organization, and then she's moving up and up, and she has her sights set very, very high by the end of the book. But I don't think she's ever depicted as being like really on board with the message of the organization. I think she's just in this for herself. I think the hype type, the promotional blurbs that are included with the book make it sound like, oh, she's this warrior goddess for the organization, but I don't think she really cares about the organization at all. She sees the phoniness at every level of it, and she just wants what she can get for herself. So,
well, Ed is playing off an age-old story about all sorts of organizations, whether it's Masonic groups or the Catholic Church or anything else that, or say, hey, let's take Scientology. Have we been shut down yet? That it's the exoteric versus the esoteric. There's a public face that people are shown, and then there's the private, real face of the organization. Of course, we see that throughout this book, that, the organization is this power for the liberation and empowerment of the common Black people. No, it's just a big scam to enrich a very small crust of the leadership. And it's tied in with that is, with the exception of Prince Haka, there's a Toni makes this kind of statement repeatedly, a personal agency. Like I said, all the characters except Prince Haka deny the ability to make choices for themselves. They all, and they use that as an excuse,
And we learn that people are
it's always
recruited, and they go after people that are prominent. Some aren't. Some people they groom, and some people are prominent, like in entertainment. We'll get there or whatnot. But we learn at one point they've got dirt on everybody.
Right.
So they kind of keep them in the organization, or they're going to release, XYZ.
Toni's
about
first
their
sexual
history.
experiences, which she thought were something of her own making, in fact, were completely scripted by the organization, which you'll love this, Greg, which reminded me of Blade Runner 2049. Who here has seen that? Anyone?
I haven't yet.
There's a scene towards the end of the movie where one of the main characters is brought before this industrialist. And he says sort of a very similar thing that's said to Toni by Madame Rose, which is, did it never occur to you that these were not your choices? This was planned for you, and you've been guided all along.
Right. There's additional to that, of course, they've essentially blackmail her by saying we filmed your sexual escapades as well, right? Which
Well,
goes back to the old boner in the face
That's an yeah.
right.
well, there are some real life examples of this. I mean, not to take this into too dark a direction, but supposedly that's how Jeffrey Epstein made his money, was
Right.
by getting wealthy and powerful people into compromising positions, documenting it, and then blackmailing. People wondered, how did Jeffrey Epstein make his money? How did this guy make all this money? That's how he made his money. So now, and more information about that keeps coming out. So, I mean, there are real life versions of this, but I think, we don't like to think that, the whole system is rotten from the top to the bottom, and it's just layers of rottenness as you go up. But that's what this book is all about. And I think Ed, having lived through the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1966, I think he just wanted to believe that this is all just some big scam, some big conspiracy theory. And one thing I will say about this book is that, are there no sympathetic characters in it? Are there no likable characters or characters that I think, like, the most sympathetic character is one who disappears from the book? And his name is Sheila. Sheila is a character. There are very similar characters to Sheila in other books. Sheila is a male prostitute who dresses as a female in case there are either gay clients or there are or women who want a man. I don't like what is this guy's job exactly? But he's as close as you get to, like, a nice or sympathetic character, because he actually talks kindly to Toni kind of earlier in the book. And I'm not exactly sure, where does he go? He kind of just disappears, and then they say he's far away. What happens to him?
He goes, quote unquote, down south. They send him, and Toni, of course, is like, "Oh, you're going to go there? That's not a good place, obviously." But interesting. Sheila talks about and implies to Toni during the discourse, we're the rabble, right? She implies we're the rabble.
The rabble.
The people who are in power. Sheila nonetheless says, I'm trying to work my way up. Toni similarly has aspirations to try to work her way up and garner some status, even though to work your way up, you're working your way up in what is they're very well aware is a corrupt organization. Interestingly enough, also going back to a point we made a little bit earlier, Toni has these moments of self-doubt where is she really all in on the fuck Whitey thing? Of course she's not, because she has these moments where she's like, the stuff that Uncle Kieran talks about in his militant rambles, and the stuff that Preacher Rail espouses about Whitey isn't true. I've met white people actually who are actually nice people.
Yeah.
And she picks up very early on in the book that often when there is violence, the people that invoked the riot are gone. They took a flight out that night before it. And so she mentions that I know lots of white people that are great, and I've noted this. So that's kind of a seed planted early on in the novel.
But I mean, she's so unsympathetic that to other people in the organization, that she's not even really sad when they die or when terrible things happen to them. She's like momentarily, there's a scene in which, not only Mama Rose, I guess is her, Madam Rose, and like 6 of her girls are killed. I mean, or they die of like suffocation because there's a fire. And Toni is sad for, I don't know, half a second, or she's sad for one sentence and then kind of moves on. Oh, it's too bad. So, Toni is not somebody who has a great deal of sympathy for other people. So, and so she doesn't really engender a lot of sympathy, I don't think, from readers that much. I don't know if you felt yourself being like really wanting Toni to succeed or wanting Toni to be safe throughout this novel. I was kind of, she's as corrupt as anyone else, really. So I think one thing that we haven't talked about is the way a lot of this book is written, the style in which this book is written, because a lot of it is written in dialect, and it's Ed Wood's very particular form of like Black dialect. What did you all think of that aspect of the book, if you wanted to?
Well, real quick, much of the narrative actually, and much of what we learn is carried via dialogue. There's long passages of dialogue throughout, and not a lot of sort of description, so to speak. He lets the characters tell the story. So, and it's kind of odd actually when you take a step back from it, because you take a step back from it, you go, who starts talking to somebody and then starts telling them, you
Their
know,
whole life story.
absolutely everything, right? Everything that
Yeah.
we want to know from a narrative standpoint. So so I thought that was fascinating. But yeah, the sort of the language that he adopts is, I think,
It's sort of, yeah,
go ahead.
rooted in minstrel shows, and maybe rooted in old movies. It seems to be maybe rooted in, yeah, like cartoons or old movies, or white people pretending to be Black people or something like that. You know, this was, even if Ed's name weren't on the cover, you could obviously tell this was written by a white person. It was obviously not written by a Black person at all.
And it
And
gets difficult to read. There is so much dialogue written in this dialect that it's tricky to read, you know, for being what it is, the kind of paperback it is. It's you got to slow down or you'll you'll get lost in the words.
Mhm.
well,
So
I
you-
know, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I wondered if I've wondered all along in seeing this aspect of some of Ed's work, if he was not influenced by this gentleman, Rourke Bradford. This is one of his books, Let the Band Play Dixie. Boy, you want to talk about somebody who has been thrust into the incinerator of history. Rourke Bradford in the 1920s and 30s published numerous books of profoundly hair-raising. He was a white guy, the editor of the New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper. Wrote about half a dozen books, all in Black dialect. Published by, well, this is published by Harper Publishers, current day Harper and Row. Wonderful reviews in the New York Times. I think by about probably the early 1960s at the latest, he was stuffed into the incinerator of history for this stuff being so racist. Because of course, for example, Let the Band Play Dixie is all about how wonderful the antebellum South was as a life for Blacks, and them telling their own story, quote unquote, right, through him. So this would have been something that would have been around, when Ed was growing up, potentially for him to be reading and to give him that idea or a model, let's say,
Right.
of writing in dialect. He was a very popular author in the 30s and 40s.
Oh, that's great.
It's funny you should mention him being thrown into the incinerator of history. There's not much about Toni Black Tigress in Nightmare of Ecstasy, but the one little anecdote that we get about that book is very, very interesting, and I think you've all probably seen it. What Ed wrote in an inscription when he gave the book away, his concern was that don't let people know my name or address, like a bombed out house I don't need. So he thought that this book was going to get him, make him the target of riots, maybe himself, and maybe that his house was going to be bombed for anything, which makes it all the more surprising that this was the book that he put his real name on.
Right.
Like,
he was smashed out of his mind when he wrote that inscription, Joe, because it's flat out fucking ridiculous, right?
right.
Who was going to even come across this book as published by this really, really obscure little adult paperback publisher? And then
I just want to interject. Interestingly enough, I think, Joe, I had written down that quote as well. that's pretty much all we know. But that little line seems took a life of its own. It's in
Right.
David Hayes' Muddled Mind, and he doesn't just quote that verbatim, like which some that looks like it was like somebody had probably Rudolph Gray transcribed that from an inscription on a book. But Hayes just went on to be like, oh, Wood had this fear of the Black Panthers and retribution. And then that goes on to the Cornell University archives, where without citing anything, they also say, oh, not only did he have a fear of the Black Panthers, but his house was firebombed. And it's
Yeah,
like,
right.
Right.
there's no citing of that, and it's a university.
So-
I just thought that was really funny how
Yeah.
that was kind of like the game of operator, you know?
Right.
But I mean, it at least shows you that Ed, how controversial this stuff could be if people actually read it or cared about it. It's the weird thing about this book is that this isn't, first and foremost, this book I think is intended as pornography, right? And it's supposed to be sexy. There are a lot of sex scenes in it. I don't know if there's anything in it that people would find terribly arousing.
It's anti-erotic.
Yeah,
it really is.
Especially the first encounter between Toni and Preacher Rail is very disturbing. Oh, we haven't gotten to the I think the ugliest scene in the book, which is the liquor store robbery.
Right.
Liquor store robbery during a riot, which I don't know. I just wanted to include a scene like that just to show like how ugly and depraved the rioters were. And so I was thinking of, Birth of a Nation here. I think we're in that territory.
Well, interestingly, in the book, up until the riots starting. Well, let me rephrase what I was going to say. After the riots start, Ed has several extremely negative portrayals of blacks in the book that he actually couches in racist terminology.
Right.
Like that scene in particular, how he describes the attackers is just outright racist. And yet the whole book up until then, he's not engaging in those kinds of descriptions of people's physicality.
Well, he does mention like their hair and their like thick lips. There's
well, but it's not in the earlier part in the book. It's really in the latter half of the book and I don't know if that's indicating something about how this was composed. That I don't know.
But we Greg and I reviewed the two Watts novels, and at least in that one, there is the main character of Rocky, who is described in a somewhat in a sympathetic way and can be brave or heroic in some aspects. And I think this book shows how Ed's attitude had really soured, in the 2 or 3 years since those books. I think that'd been 2 years, I guess, since the Watts books. And if anything, his attitudes had only gotten uglier and harsher over the course of those 2 years.
Well, one of the early actions in that riot is a father murdering his own 3 children in order to blame it on white police. He shoots them all in the head or whatever. So, I thought the book seemed to cleave at that point. Up until that point, the degree to which any of the characters were negative, it was sort of like run-of-the-mill negative things that could, but from that point forward, there were some really, I thought, much more negative actions and characterizations by him. And before I lose a thread, when you're talking about just Ed's books in general, on his resume, he claims this novel, Riot, Rape, and Revelry, supposedly by the same publisher as Toni Black Tigress. And of course, on page 38 of Toni Black Tigress, he actually has the phrase Revelry, Rape, and Riot. And I'm wondering if was Ed just drunk when he was writing that resume, and he listed Toni under two different titles, and Riot, Rape, and Revelry doesn't actually exist as a separate
Oh,
book.
that is interesting. I've written about that phrase, riot, rape, and revelry, before, because it turns up on Criswell's
Criswell.
album. He has a whole routine in that about the riots, rates, and revelry. And I guess it was my suspicion that Ed might have helped Criswell write some of that album and write some of his material. So that very specific phrase, riots, rape, and revelry, I don't think would occur to just two random people, just just by pure coincidence. So I think, yeah, that was obviously a phrase that was bouncing around in Ed's mind. And I think it does wind up on that Criswell album, and it does wind up in this book as well. And I always wondered about that book that's listed on his resume. I think Ed was known to, with both books and film projects, to, if it were known under two or more names, he might put it down on his resume twice, and it would look like he'd made twice as many movies or written twice as many books. So yeah, Sheila says something very interesting about the riot, rape, and revelry. It says, I think we're the revelry part of the riot, rape, and revelry. So like they're the fun part, I guess, of the organization. The sex part, is the riot, rape. There, everybody else is doing the rioting. And go ahead.
Well,
I just say, Jim, just because you had mentioned a potential double title for this, I just had tried to. This is kind of a footnote. I just was interested in, this is private edition books. It was what this was imprinted on. It's now Ferguson Plumbing Supply.
I know. I had to look that up on Google Maps, and it's a very weird place for a business to be, because it's like a kind of a sharp corner, and then like you wouldn't think of a business even being there. It looks like kind of a sharp corner that you're taking. But there's like two like plumbing kind of businesses.
This is a sad commentary that we all do this.
Yeah.
Well, that was the first thing I did when I saw the address. I said, "Oh, Canoga Park." I had to find that.
But two things I wanted to mention about it is just that on Ed's resume, he writes Columbia Canoga Park. So I don't know if anyone knows anything about Columbia versus private edition books, but also Casey Lorraine went to Canoga Park High School. I just wanted to throw that in.
I did actually. I went so far as to actually, I haven't heard back from her, but a few days ago I emailed Casey Lorraine and asked her about the address of on Deering Avenue, right? It's right on there.
Yeah, the building is still there.
7805 Deering Avenue. So I said, "Hey, do you remember that address back in the 1960s? That was the offices for an adult paperback publisher." So Columbia, yes. So private editions would just be one of the imprints for Columbia publishers, because Nighttime Les, another Ed Wood book, was also published by quote unquote Columbia.
Yeah. Well, okay, Nighttime Les. That is another book where there is a male character who dresses in female clothing as part of his job, I guess. He's sort of like a cross-dressing bartender character. So, and he eventually ends up marrying the Nighttime Les. The Nighttime Les gets pregnant and they need a husband. And so, of course, she's going to marry the cross-dressing bartender guy. So that character from Nighttime Les very much reminded me of Sheila in Toni Black Tigress. So that's why I was disappointed when Sheila disappeared. So I was like, oh well, I guess we're done with that character. So
I also thought of I forget the name of the character, but it was based on a real person from I think it's What's the Difference. There was the old director had a maid.
Oh yeah.
And that was based on a real director and a real assistant. Yeah. But I thought of that character, that real person, when I read about Sheila.
Well, speaking of the Watts characters and the show business aspect of it, there's one kind of semi-major character in this book we haven't really discussed yet, which is Fuzz Harrison, I think. Yeah. And it shows you, I said that Ed's attitude had soured since the Watts novels. And the character of Fuzz Harrison shows you how he's soured, because what happens to Fuzz is pretty much the same thing that happens to Rocky. Rocky is a successful actor, and then the organization wants to, assimilate him and make him part of it, and so like he can help spread their propaganda. And Rocky stays strong, but Fuzz doesn't stay strong. Fuzz puts up a fight for like 1 page or something, and then by the end, he's just like part of the council of evil that meets, to plan more deception and lies on behalf of the organization. So Fuzz shows you how, the character, how Ed's attitude had darkened even in the last 2 years. So yeah, Fuzz is sort of a lesser version of Rocky, because what is Fuzz's show? Did they mention what? Oh, Fuzz.
He has a PI show.
Yeah. He started off as like a minstrel singer and guitar player, and then he became a movie private eye who, and this is the part that I just got a great laugh out of, was he pushed, his private eye pushed Charlie Chan off the screen, and Ed says something about the Hawaiian Chinese Charlie Chan being all upset about the black man pushing the Chinaman out of the movie theater, right?
Yeah.
Off the movie screen. But of course, Charlie Chan was always played by white guys. So there was no, the character Charlie Chan himself, yes, was a Hawaiian Chinese detective. But of course, there was no real Chinese Charlie Chan to get upset about this. It would have been one of 3 white actors across the history of Charlie Chan.
But one was Swedish, wasn't
one of them was Swedish? Yeah. That's about as far from China as you can get, I think. So.
Yeah. So yeah,
Joe, before we started, you had mentioned some historical perspective,
right,
that could kind of go around and this was all before our time, obviously, but I think that's important to note. That it was like 1968. Martin Luther King, who Reverend Rail may be portrayed after, was assassinated, and thereafter, during the riots after that assassination, President Johnson signed the 1968 Civil Rights Act. And in that same year, in 68, and I just don't know. I'm also mentioning this because I don't know if Fuzz is based on anyone real or if he's made up, but Bill Cosby was an I Spy, and in 68 he started a singing career. And also in 68 he narrated something written by Andy Rooney on CBS about, I can't remember now, but it was like the contributions of African Americans. And a lot of people got upset that Bill Cosby had they thought he became political, and it was very controversial, but enough where they replayed it because it was also very popular. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, if maybe that's where Fuzz comes from, and if people were unhappy that Bill Cosby became political.
I think Ed would have been, every time he saw a black celebrity becoming outspoken politically in any way, he would have thought, oh, this is all just more of the scam. Just as more the corrupt organization has gotten to him too. And to be honest, we see echoes of this kind of thinking still today in 2023 when celebrities are conspiracy theorists are more prevalent than ever. People thinking that everything is coordinated behind the scenes. I mean, the very idea that the Malcolm X assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination were coordinated behind the scenes as part of some sort of propaganda or publicity campaign for any kind of political movement is absurd. But Ed, I think, might have been in a state of mind where he believed it. And you have people like that today who see stories in the news and think, oh, this must all be coordinated behind the scenes. They see everything as being as a conspiracy, and they see everything like the media controls all the narrative. So I was just very surprised to see these assassinations being treated that way in a book. But maybe if all that was happening now, people would be talking about that way on the internet right now. So Ed would probably be, one of these internet conspiracy theorists now. And I've heard a theory that America's current political divide, the red state, blue state stuff, can actually be traced back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and people feeling like it was the North imposing its values on the South, and the South, telling the South how things should be done, and so throughout his writing, Ed is very anti-civil rights movement. Ed is very anti-integration. He doesn't like integration. There was a scene in Drag Trade where a bar is integrated, and we're supposed to sympathize, I guess, with the white people who are trying to keep the black people out of the bar. And so it is shocking, I think, to modern eyes to read this stuff. So
it's funny to think of a cross-dressing individual as Archie Bunker.
Exactly.
It's kind of that where we're at.
He's got the clan robes with the lace and the
yes, exactly. It's like you'd think he'd be more tolerant, but he's not at all. And that's why
that's one of the great myths, though, right? That the North somehow that it was the South that was the racist part of the U.S. and that the North was somehow a lot better. But of course, you look back to the 1920s and the most Klan membership you can find were in states like Indiana and Pennsylvania. It wasn't in southern states. So there was more than enough blame for that to go around. And certainly Poughkeepsie, there was a well-known history of lots of racism in that part of New York State when Ed was growing up. So
I was born in 1968, just actually 5 days before MLK was assassinated. And in the early 1970s, I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania. You mentioned Pennsylvania, Jim, and I still live there. But yes, racism still quite prevalent. If you're out at the local watering hole or whatever, and you're with a bunch of middle-aged white guys, they will say outright racist things pretty commonly. It's pathetic, right? Here we are in 2023. Things haven't really changed all that much. But in the early 1970s, when I was a little kid, the Klan announced that they were going to do a parade in the little town that I lived in. It ultimately didn't happen. It sparked minor controversy, but that was in like 1973 or 75.
Right. Yeah. Well, I have to bring this around to one of my other passions besides Ed Wood. I do a weekly podcast about Happy Days, and Happy Days is set in Milwaukee, which remains in 2023 one of the most segregated cities in America. And whenever Black characters are brought onto Happy Days, which is not often, they're almost always there to be the victims of racism. They only use Black characters on Happy Days when they want to do a story about racism. And of course, there's an absurd episode where Fonzie goes down south and he integrates a diner or something, by snapping his fingers and saying, "Hey," and the diner gets integrated. I wondered what would happen like 5 seconds after he left, So, but in the Watts novels, we have a sympathetic character of Rocky who wonders, why does the world treat me badly because I'm Black? What's so bad about being Black? Why is that some sort of stigma? And we don't get anything like that in Toni Black Tigress. If there is so-called racism, it's mainly, being exaggerated by Black people for their own, so they can take advantage of it, So that's why I said his attitude had soured or corroded since even the Watts novels, because in there, you at least get some sense that Ed feels that Rocky has experienced racism and unfairly. And in this, all the Black characters are basically just spoiled, ungrateful people, Scat Blue, who's always being described as ugly, and he is taken advantage. His alcoholic father and his whore mother, and he's going to college on a scholarship, and he doesn't even appreciate all the handouts he's gotten. And so this is Ed as the racist guy at the end of the bar, you know, giving you his thoughts, you know, about the news of the day. You can almost imagine him like in a bar in 1968 or 9, and then there's news of riots on the television set in the bar, and he tells you, listen, here's what's wrong with the black people in America today. They don't want it, you know, and that's what this book is. He puts like all of his ugliest, worst thoughts into this book. And there is no, is there any like actual racist white character in this at all? I don't remember.
There is the millionaire who stops giving money to the organization.
Right, that guy. What was up with that guy?
I mean, that's just like such a brief cameo, right? He just shows up to basically for you to get this little picture that he's not a nice guy, but then he's off to go get syphilis and he's gone for the rest of the book.
Okay. That reminded me of Ed's story, The Whorehouse Horror, where there is a whorehouse where you send your enemies to the whorehouse and pay in advance, and then they go to the whorehouse and then they get syphilis. And that's your revenge on them.
Ed, were you scarred by your real life experiences much? Come on.
Yeah.
The syphilis as the weapon there. Yeah.
So yeah, they're that struck me as a weird thing to turn up in a. Don't they like intentionally give him? Don't they intentionally give him syphilis? Yeah.
Bessie Sin does, a hooker named Bessie Sin.
She's the siniest.
She's the siniest. Oh, yes. I love that word.
She's been specifically reserved for that guy whose name I can't recall that night to.
Yeah. But I think his character shows you like. How deep the corruption goes. Like, oh, even up at the top, there's like there's rich business people that are funding all this, and it's white business people. They don't even care about race relations. Like,
no. It's just because he felt it allowed him to walk safely in the black neighborhood, so he could go dip his wick. You know? Yes.
So that's where I get into this conspiracy theory stuff, like oh, and it's all being funded by scumbags, you know. So that's where Ed's mind was at when he looked at this, like, oh, what's behind it, you know, where's the money coming from for this, you know. So
you know, Joe, I think there's one sympathetic character, because that stuck in my head when you asked that, is Tony's father. Who worked on the plantation, of course. I mean, this book gets pretty transgressive, but he is on his deathbed.
Yeah.
And he, you know, has picked cotton for his life. And he asks, am I picking cotton for the angels' robes? Or will I see, you know, the pearly gates? Or will God be black? That's probably the most sympathetic moment. And it's brief. It's like 1 page long in the whole book.
The reason why I couldn't take those passages of the book as seriously as maybe they are intended is because this is where sort of the minstrelsy of the book reaches its you know, peak or nadir, I guess, is that this is written like what's that musical? That's that movie with the like Green Pastures or whatever it's called. Well, anyway, there's a movie where there's a very minstrel show like depiction of heaven. I think features black actors in it, and this is where Ed is writing totally out of his mind. Like, Ed has no clue of what it's like to be black in the South, but he's, other than what he's gotten through pop culture, and that's what's invaded his mind, and that's what he comes out when he writes these scenes. So the dialect is never thicker or gooier than it is in those scenes of Tony's past and with Tony's father. And yeah, the scene of his scene of her father dying should be like a heartrending moment, but instead it's like kind of embarrassing camp kind of moment. So yeah, I hadn't even considered that, but
I think just to toss a sort of counter thought out there. Yes, clearly this is a book that is very offensive and would offend a common sensibility to a great deal. But to the earlier point, I think Ed's viewpoint on humanity generally by this point in his life is so jaundiced and so misanthropic that I'm not sure that him being racist really captures it all. I'm not trying to defend him, by the way, for having written this book, but it's beyond that. It's beyond that. He absolutely, there's nothing really positive. He has no positive view on anybody of any color for that matter at this point in his life. And I'm also curious as to why we talked about Black Myth previously. This book, there's the Watts books. Why is you can read I have actually read a ton of adult paperbacks from this era. Not a whole lot of other writers were really talking about the the dynamic, the racial dynamic that was happening in the country at that time. It meant something to him. He also, one more thought, he lists on one of his resumes that he was a campaign speechwriter for Sam Yorty, which I think may or may not be relevant.
Yeah. The reason why Ed's racism comes through, even for me, more strongly even than his general misanthropy, is that he goes out of his way to describe so many of the Black characters in this as being uneducated, and he really goes overboard in describing Scat as being ugly every single time he's on there. And one little tiny detail that bothered me in this book, especially, I don't know why this bothered me, but he was talking about why Toni couldn't get a job as like a secretary. And it was because he says she wouldn't know one end of the alphabet from the other. And she had made it as far as, I think, like her second year of high school. That's what her education level is. And I said, come on, Ed, she wouldn't know one end of the alphabet from the other. You just a few pages ago had her reading like this dossier of incriminating information, and now you're having her as being totally illiterate that she wouldn't know her way around the alphabet. So that comment struck me. I don't think. Yes, his view of humanity in general and the world in general, I think, was a very jaundiced, as you say. But I think, like, for me, somehow, like, his specific contempt for Black people kind of stands out even there. I think, like, he had a general contempt for humanity and for everyone. We often say that sometimes you can tell from a book or an article or a story what kind of mood Ed was in. And was he in a hopeful mood or more coherent? I guess he's more or less coherent here, but except in the first few chapters where I was finding it sometimes difficult to find my place. Like, where are we here? Like, it seemed like kind of nested flashbacks, but then it kind of gets onto a more straight and narrow track for the rest of the book. But Toni Black Tigress seems to me to be a product of Ed at his most negative, in his worst mood. Like, which made, I think this would very much limit the book's commercial possibilities now would be absolutely zero. I would not say that, and I wouldn't even say that if people often talk about should Ed's books be republished, and I think the ones that have remained more or less in print, things like Death of Transvestite and Devil Girls, I think those are the more palatable books. I would say that again, I always point to the three carnival-based books, Sideshow Siren, Carnival Peace, and Merry-Go-Round, as being maybe more saleable, more palatable to the general public. Toni Black Tigress is a book that it's not him. I don't think it's his most transgressive book ever, not in a world where the oralists exists, but it's down there. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is not a book for the faint of heart, I wouldn't say. I would say this is a book for people who, I've often said that sometimes when you talk about Ed's work, Ed will sometimes challenge you, like, how far do you want to go? Are you willing to go this far? Are you willing to go a little farther? And I remember in my earliest explorations of Ed's catalog in the 1990s, let's say, the movie that was then being marketed as Pretty Maids All in a Row, or Pretty Models All in a Row. It's now The Photographer, or Love Feast, or whatever you might want to call it. For me, that was the point at which I said, no, I got to stop. This is too far. Now I can watch that movie and it's not a problem. But do you want to go further? How much further do you want to go? And
Tony's got some great wood resonances in it, though. I mean, you have you've got the stereotypical cross-dresser, you have the stereotypical sloppy drunks that are always described, their drinking habits are always described sort of in the same fashion. Scat Blue harkens back to Glen or Glenda. There's the very text there saying, why should a man be denied the feeling of luscious things in his own privacy? Should it always be the woman who has the finery? Think back to Glen or Glenda.
There's feathers, fluff, and finery all through, and like a lot of his. And if you're one of those in the so bad it's good mindset, if you want some like clunker sentences, oftentimes Ed will have very long, very confusingly worded sentences and very odd word choices and things like that. Oh, you'll find that all through Toni Black Tigress. If you want some real howlers, you'll find them.
But that's the more human Ed that's still carrying forward from his earlier day, or the more, the more, what's the word I'm looking for? More altruistic Ed, right? People always look at Glen or Glenda as his call for
tolerance or acceptance.
Call for acceptance and treating other people.
Well, I found that acceptance is accept and acceptance. That's an idea that goes through a lot of his work, and it's in this book too. There's a use of accept and acceptance. But if you want the campier, funnier aspects of Ed's writing, his very weird syntax and stuff like that, sure, Toni Black Tigress has it. And there are some passages where I would say, Ed, how did you get to that sentence? But what I will say is that lots of Ed's stories and novels and nonfiction books have that same kind of syntax and are less transgressive than this. So if you want that Ed Wood flavor, you can get it in books that are easier to digest than this one. This is one that I would say this is for the grad students of Ed. I don't think that this is one that this is not for featherweights here. This is one that will test you a little bit, because some people will get to the very early in the book, they'll get to all the stuff that's written in dialect and they'll say, you know what, no, I can't with this. So and they'll set it down. So I don't know that this book has a commercial future or something. Do you think it could have been made into a film?
I've thought actually a lot about that, and I think that in some ways the larger part of the narrative, if you step back from the Toni and the day-to-day that's depicted amongst the characters, that there's a scope to it. So I'll give it away. When I sent the invite to these gentlemen for this Zoom podcast, I called it quote unquote "Gone with the Angora." So I think think about it, we're roughly 100 years on from the Civil War, and we have the city burning. We have well, we talked. You mentioned it, Rob. Tony's father, the plantation, right? That's an interesting little kernel of true history, that slavery didn't end at the end of the Civil War. Essentially, there were families who lived on plantations and fundamentally continued to do the same thing for generations thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Right. I guess that's what gets people confused about the movie Song of the South, because that's actually taking place after the Civil War. Yeah. And I thought of I did think of Joel Chandler Harris when I was reading some of this, because it was Joel. His kind of dialect writing is somewhat similar to what Ed tries in this book. So, yeah, I would think that
I guess we can just be glad that Ed didn't live into the 1980s and write for Star Distributors, because
Right.
they put out, you know, transgressive stuff that makes Ed at his worst look like Mr. Rogers, you know?
Right.
Well, I think that if there were a demon on Ed's shoulders, I think he could get as dark as you would want. I think if he thought that
If there's
maybe
a paycheck in it.
a paycheck in it, yeah, if there's like, and it wouldn't have to be a good paycheck either. It wouldn't, you know, it could be any amount of money. And I was a freelance.
Step out for a second.
Okay. I mean, I was a freelance writer for a few years, and I would know that you know, sometimes I would take writing assignments that I didn't necessarily want, but I would say, oh yeah, it's $15. It's a $25 article or something. So yeah, I'll write about that. So, and I didn't have the crippling alcohol addiction that Ed had. So speaking of which, last night I was just apropos of nothing, I was watching Blackula on Svengoolie, and there's a chase scene in Blackula that goes right by Playboy Liquor, and you see the Playboy Liquor. You see the Playboy Liquor sign that looks exactly the way it looks today. So, and
for everybody, that was Ed's liquor store across the street from, or kitty corner from his last apartment.
So this is, you know, this was on Yucca. This was near Yucca Flats, his apartment that was known as Yucca Flats. And the thing I pointed out last night was that if you go on Google Maps and you find Playboy Liquor, and then you turn the camera around, you'll find the apartment building where Carol Burnett grew up. So it's like Carol Burnett's, like, she went to Hollywood High, and the apartment building where she was living during those times was right across the street from Playboy Liquor, which I think gives you an idea of where Carol was coming from. I think she was certainly by the 70s was living far from Playboy Liquor, I would hope. So, but yeah, the thing that's great about that movie, and a lot of movies from that era, is that they are all accidentally documentaries of the time. You know, you get to see the decor. Blackula is great for that. There is decor and so many locations in and around Hollywood and in and around Los Angeles. You'll say, oh, that's a real place. That's a real place. That's a real place. So, so even if you're not involved in the story, which is a pretty good story, yeah, there's all these kind of details in it. So I don't know if there's anything like that in Toni Black Tigress, where it's like, you know, picturing the Los Angeles of 1969. I guess the riots, but
well, the thing the thing about when you read Toni Black Tigress, I'm going to say half, I don't know, for about the first half of the book, if you read there's very few geographical clues. And
right.
Initially you're led to believe that it's not on the West Coast, because there's some little references to the things in Watts occurring back on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And so at first I was thinking, oh, this is taking place in a city somewhere in the Midwest. But then about halfway through the book, there's actually references that place it in the LA basin. So, but I think, you know, that's just Ed being a little sloppy in composition.
Well, and the organization's intent, Jim, is to take what happened in Watts and what,
right,
you know, the kind of cultural zeitgeist of the moment on the West Coast, to take it all the way back to the East Coast. You know, that's the organization's intent, and that's why these guys are on speaking tours around the country and things of that nature. So I wanted to kind of go down the road real quick. We talked a little bit briefly previously here about this is a sex paperback. It is in fact like 48 pages into the book when we have the first sex scene. So we're considerably far into the book before we actually get to a sex scene. And it's a violent sadomasochistic sex scene where Toni gives as good as she gets, so to speak. I'm not trying to quote Ed there, but
right.
but Preacher Rail is, of course, extremely responsive to that. He likes that she's not, strictly an easy mark, and she applies a little bit of the pressure in reverse. But it's at that point in the book when, again, first 4 chapters or so, long swaths of dialogue explaining the story. It's at that point in the book when his language goes boom and changes into something very sort of almost ecstatic. And I just I'll read just one quick passage to give you a sense of it, because in all likelihood, most of you are actually probably never going to read Toni Black TIGRESS, but the sex scene, we're towards the end of a long, violent sex scene between Toni and Preacher Rail, and then the kaleidoscope of colors and noises shot through her head and came out in searing passions as he exploded into her, and she around him. Later, when Toni lay exhausted on the bed, naked and used, Madame Rose walked into the room with Sheila, who still wore the blue marabou negligee. Sheila carried a basin of cool water and a cloth which she used to soothe Toni's body. "He's in love with you," mumbled Rose. "You've made a friend for life. That's the way it is. That's the way he likes to make love, and you responded exactly as you should. Yes, ma'am, you've got a real friend there." And then, of course, he can't. It's kind of it's reasonably well. Am I wrong to say it's reasonably well written? Of course, he closes the chapter though with a little bit of a kind of corny joke where he said Toni could only mumble, "With him as a friend, I don't need any enemies," after what is a pretty horrific scene of sexual abuse.
Kaleidoscopes actually turn up as an image in Ed's writing more often than you'd think. And we should talk about maybe some of the classic wood motifs that are in here. You mentioned marabou. She does have a pink Angora sweater, I think, at one point. And of course, there's alcohol. This is not even close to his booziest novel. But the alcohol in most of Ed's black themed novels, the alcohol of choice is gin, and gin is what's in here. And in fact, in the Watts novels, I think Rocky doesn't like to drink gin because it makes him look low class, and so he has moved up to better quality of alcohol. So I'm a non-drinker myself, so I don't know. Gin and Scotch whiskey, it all means the same thing to me. So I don't really have like a paradigm in my brain for what is high class liquor and what is not.
I think Madame Rose, when we're first introduced to her, that opening scene when she talks to Toni and introduces her to the notion that she's going to become a whore for a quote unquote whore for the organization. Madame Rose, from the standpoint of somebody who does drink, it's fucking insane how much she drinks in the space of literally a couple of pages. If you literally, and again, I have a reasonable tolerance for alcohol because I drink. If I drank that much in the space of 10 minutes, I would be utterly and completely not only passed out, I'd probably be dead from alcohol poisoning.
Well, the other thing about Madame Rose in that first appearance is that Ed describes her as having the appearance of the grave. And like looking like made up, I guess with a lot of white powder on her or on her face. I don't know.
Rather matronly, Joe, and we know what you think about matrons and sex.
Well, the thing is, Ed doesn't wallow in one of his other. I don't think he really wallows in his death fixations as much as he does. But Ed will bring stuff around to cemeteries and graves and bodies and coffins and things like that. Even if the story he's writing or the article he's writing has nothing to do with it, he will turn it towards that. And so he kept that a little bit in check. So
he did it. He did it with. Let me see. It was the scene when he's describing Prince Haka tempting Preacher Rail. Right? It's practically biblical. Haka's offering him all the wonders of the world, like when Satan takes Jesus up on top of a mountain and says, all of this will be yours if you just do my bidding. There's a similar scene with Haka like that, and then like 2 pages later, he describes Haka's voice as this dark voice of death.
Okay.
So in the same way that there's this little bit of that kind of symbolism with Madame Rose, you can see a little bit of that with Haka in the book. And, you know, just jumping back slightly, you know, when you're talking about Ed's language concerning sex, Greg, you know, reading this book again, occasionally with Ed, I feel like I'm almost reading descriptions by someone who actually hasn't had any sexual experiences, you know.
Well,
and here's the quote I'll read off of page 164. Hell, baby, you got all it takes to get my gun off like the big A-bomb was busting in my guts. You know, I would, you know, I can't imagine ever describing an orgasm that way. And what it makes me think of is, if you've ever seen the movie with Steve Carell, 40-Year-Old Virgin, he's this guy who's has no experience really with women, and he's trying to come up with this little anecdote to like regale the guys with. And he talks about how this woman she had these great breasts and, you know, felt like a bag of sand.
yeah.
And of course, all the other guys at the poker table are, you know, get these weird looks, you know.
I've had to wonder during a lot of these dirty stories and books that Ed's writes, like what Ed's actual sex life was like in the late 60s and 70s.
Oh.
Grim, I'm thinking. I don't know. I have no idea what his sex life was actually like. So
Greg and I have some rumors that maybe we.
Sorry,
I was just say Greg and I have some rumors. We might touch on it another time. We need some reassurance, but I don't know that he was, even though he had a bad drinking problem. I think there were some he was getting busy, but I'll just leave it at that. I did just want to mention though, there is a lot of metaphors about weapons attributed to genitalia, arrows, targets, and then you just mentioned the granddaddy of them.
Target becomes his euphemism for vagina. I think like twice or 2 or 3 times he uses target. Look, men have their arrows and women have their targets. So,
and I think that, you know, if we can talk about how this book in some ways is very bad, but as Jim pointed out, the names besides the protagonists have deeper meaning, but they're also these metaphors are working towards the finale of the book using these metaphors, I think. So there's some literary merit found in this book, believe it or not.
Joe, with that question about Ed, you know, the nature of Ed's sex life reminded me of a great little interview piece I saw recently, an old interview with Ron Jeremy, the porn star. And the interviewer at one point said to him, you know, something along the lines of like, wow, it must be great to be Ron Jeremy, because you have all these beautiful women you get to screw. And he said, yeah, they only do that because they're paid to do it. In my regular life, I screw women who look like Gene Simmons.
Right
so probably that's probably what Ed's life was more like, you know, was the,
well,
you know, just a regular person like himself, you know, and probably maybe somebody else with an alcohol problem. Not anything we'd want to see in a photo novel for sure.
Well, I will give Ed this one bit of credit in this book. I would say for the most part, this is a very anti-Black, but he, at least in physical terms, describes Toni very favorably. She's one of Ed's favorite kind of female characters, which is the woman who is so gorgeous and so desirable and so perfect that basically all the men in her orbit kind of fall for her immediately upon seeing her. Every time normally if he has a character named Shirley, every Shirley is like, you know, this perfect female goddess kind of character. So he always describes Toni in very favorable terms, at least physically. So he doesn't like the Black Power movement, and he doesn't like the slogan. He doesn't like, you know, Black is beautiful. He doesn't like that phrase, obviously, the way it's used here. But he at least allows that a Black woman could be very sexually desirable. So
and even compliments her pubic hair.
Yes, he does. She has like silky or something, what does he compare it to? Like she has like this silky or satiny pubic hair. Well, he mentions all of his, I mean, silk and satin are all through the book. There's Angora, there's a little bit of booze, there's a little bit of death talk. Sometimes he lets his fetishes and his obsessions run away with him and they take over the narrative and they cloud out everything else in his mind. Here, I would say he keeps it in check so that, you know, other than maybe the cross-dressing, I guess.
But you know, Joe, to your point earlier, I thought it seems like she's gonna be a badass with a gun, and you think at least her sexuality is gonna be used as a weapon. But I just wanted to bring up the dichotomy of the soft-spoken preacher who's rough in the bedroom and the tough-talking Scat Blue who wears, you know, cross dresses in the bedroom and is very gentle.
Right.
But she just becomes a concubine of these mid-level guys in the organization. She doesn't do anything at that point in the novel, like until about halfway, midpoint in the novel. She doesn't go anywhere. She doesn't, you know, she's been trained from 13 to 18, but then she just ends up in a house of ill repute.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously prostitution is one of the major themes or motifs in Ed's writing, and it's something that he comes back to over and over and over and over and over and over again in his short stories, his novels, his nonfiction. I always had this theory that Ed was so obsessed with prostitution because he felt like a prostitute in his own life, in his own career. So that's why he keeps writing about prostitutes. And even in this, there is a little bit of a of the prostitutes, because I think there's a reference to her being a private girl. Like she's not going to be like hoard out to just everybody. Right. She's going to be like the private girl. And Ed had a short story called Private Girl. I think it's now anthologized in Blood Splatters Quickly if you're looking for it. Yeah. So there is, well, the stratification of, if you read that book of his nonfiction articles, When the Topic is Sex, the stratification of the prostitution world is a big topic. One, like, here's where you are at the top of that game. Here's where you are if you're in the middle. Here's where you are when the lowest. And here's where you are when you're bottom of the barrel. And a theme throughout all those books is that you don't age well in the prostitution business. And Toni has fears along those lines as well. So strippers and prostitutes who are aging poorly, that's a big concern of Ed's, because I think he himself was obviously aging poorly. And I think she even thinks about like, well, when I get too old, I'll just kill myself. That seems like, you know, that seems like the best possible solution, but I'm going to have some fun until I get there. So Ed couldn't even conceive of somebody, you know, growing old gracefully, I guess, in that how old is she supposed to be? Like she's in her early 20s? How old is
she's 18 when she
18 when she starts?
18 at the start of the book. Yeah.
Okay. So she's already thinking that she's aging too much and she's already looking for the way out. She doesn't want to get killed, but she wants to go out on her own terms, I guess. So I guess maybe there you could say there's a tiny bit of, okay, that's the other thing. And we've talked about Ed's racism. Is this a misogynistic book as well? Does he have contempt for women? Or maybe it's just a contempt for humanity. I don't know.
That's kind of where my head's at, Joe.
Yeah.
And again, I'm feeling like to, you know, pigeonhole Ed as a quote unquote racist, or to pigeonhole him as a misogynist. It's beyond that. Like he really has a very bleak view of absolutely everything imaginable.
The thing is, I can't get away from the Ed, or Ed's has racist ideas in his head, because there just seems to be persistent. It just seems to be too persistent.
Right.
I think he calls a character a burrhead and stuff like that in the book. And he does use the N-word. And so it seems like he might have a blanket contempt for humanity, but he seems to have a special contempt for
I'm
Black
trying
people.
for all you Ed Wood fans. I'm trying to defend Ed to the extent that I can here, guys. And
Well, I don't go into.
I'm joking. I'm joking. There's really no defending it, right? It's really.
I don't go into these books hoping to find awful stuff. I mean, I go into these books because I find Ed's world kind of fascinating to explore, and getting into Ed's mindset and the cadence of his writing is something that's very appealing to me. His odd choice of words, his odd syntax, his odd sentence structure, all of which you will find in this book. I don't go into it saying, boy, I hope to find something I can use against Ed. But I couldn't help it.
Just to go back and answer your question sincerely, yes, he's certainly a misogynist, right? I mean, he depicts women almost entirely as sexual objects, and yeah, they don't age well. They're of no use, essentially, at that point. I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but we're talking about death. Again, most of you are never going to read this book. Anybody want to share with us what ultimately transpires from a narrative standpoint?
Let's don't go there quite yet.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just wanted to talk about a couple plot points that move us there. And one is that Toni is starting to sock away some money, and so that's when she starts to have these thoughts of having a different life. And she also overhears Madame Rose fixing, or what we assume is fixing
heroin, I guess.
Preacher Rail, and we don't know more about that till later. But we go, oh, and we can tell that he's an addict. It's not just he's getting he's a heroin addict. And anyway, that just kind of sets the tone for a change in the book and what's going to transpire later.
Well, I misread that initially. I just thought, oh, he's on top of everything else. Oh, he's also a heroin addict. And I was like sitting in judgment. I was saying, oh, look, this guy is just purely disgusting. Boy, he's also a junkie. He preaches, but he's also a junkie. Well, as we learn, there might be extenuating circumstances behind his drug use, and I don't know. It seems like they would have enough money to send him. Doesn't the organization have money to send him to like a legitimate doctor or something? I mean,
or has this been part of their plan with him to make him this martyr type figurehead?
Maybe
we'll use him as long as we need to, and then we'll just take him out. And
so, I mean, if
useful martyr,
if no one is sacred in the organization, how can like Prince Haka or Scat Blue have any kind of job security? They can't. I mean, the organization seems to be larger than even them. So don't they feel like, we might get taken out ourselves? I mean, it always reminded me, like, what is the motivation for the bad guys in any of the Star Wars movies? Like, there's no good jobs in the Empire at all. If you're at the lowest point, they treat you like crap. You're expendable. But if you move up into the middle levels, into the higher levels, they'll dump you. They'll turn on you in like 2 seconds. So, what is your motivation to keep going? And the same here. Like, if people, I think the tippy top of the organization is in Washington. I got that impression. Yeah. So if the people in Washington decide, hey, Prince Haka is a liability, or Scat Blue, and I only hope that Scat's name is a reference, I guess, to jazz singing. I would hope. Although Ed will go down that the scatological road. He will wallow in that stuff if you let him. And that's one of my least favorite aspects, when Ed decides, ooh, I'm going to get really gross with this story, or because he will do that. But what is their motivation? Because they have to know, like, if they can just get rid of people, well, then somebody can get rid of them.
It's sort of like the mob motivation, right?
Yeah.
You build your power base. You're pulling in lots of money for a nice lifestyle for yourself. You try to build your own little fiefdom to protect yourself and jockey with other people to hopefully one day get one up over on them and get to the next level, you know. But yeah, ultimately, you know,
Yeah.
could be your friend coming to kill you.
Yeah, well, that's in every single mob movie. There's nobody who's even the capo de tutti capo or whatever is not safe in a mob movie. So if the organization is basically like a mafia type of organization, that I know I would hope that Toni would eventually maybe realize that and take what money she has, including some money that she, I believe, got from Madame Rose, like take this money for safekeeping, and along with some classified documents here that she has. I was just hoping for her to just like take that money, move to another town, just like forget the organization, just go like live a completely different kind of life and just try and leave all that behind. But that doesn't occur to Toni, I don't think, at all. She's even toward the end, she's got her eyes still on the prize. But what prize? There's not, you know, that's why I always say, like, that's why I always thought like the Empire doesn't ever make sense to me in the Star Wars movies. Is like, what is aspiring to what? You know, you're probably going to be wind up being chopped in half with a lightsaber, or pushed into some big canyon, or something like that, or a big cavernous hole in a ship somewhere. Like, what is your motivation to move up in this organization? So Toni, I would say, look around at what's happening to the people in your organization, and maybe take that money, get on a bus, and, you know, go to Oregon or something.
You wanted a happy Hollywood ending, not
well, at least a more, you know, just like get out. And you know, because like where does she live in this book? Even like, does she just live in the whorehouse, or
yeah, she's at the whorehouse and then at that hotel after the riots start.
Yeah, what did you think of that hotel? What did you think that was supposed to be, like a nice place, or do you think that was like the hotel where she's staying after she's
It's
like
a fairly featureless placeholder location.
Yeah, they do have a guy that comes like deliver her food or something. So I was like,
It is 10 stories high at least.
She
you
looks
know.
out she looks out a window, you know, that's about all we really get out of it.
So I don't know, if I were her, I would you know, buy a fedora, a trench coat, get my money in a bag or something, and get on the first Greyhound to someplace else, and try and leave all this behind. One plot point I didn't get was that, of course, when she gets this dossier of documents, you know, of this incriminating stuff, she of course reads through it, but then like she somehow reseals it or something, and they don't think that she knows, and then they tell her anyway. That was a little.
We should point out that Madame Rose gives her all these juicy details and all her money, and tells her to get out of there because sparks have hit the roof of the house
tarp,
of ill repute.
yeah.
And they go, everybody except for Toni they go and hide in the basement. And she goes into the 10th floor of this hotel and looks down upon the scene.
Yeah, the whorehouse has a tar paper roof, which I don't know exactly what tar paper is, but it sounds very flammable to me.
It's a cheap roofing material, usually for flat roofs.
Okay, so
Not always.
It doesn't sound like it would hold up to anything, because they were supposed to spare the whorehouse. You know, the rioters were supposed to spare it, but I guess the wind carried the fire, and so sparks carried the fire.
Yeah.
So they go into some sort of like, I don't know, cellar or panic room, I guess, and of course, and she wonders, like Toni wonders as she's leaving, like, what's gonna protect him down there? That doesn't seem like that'd work, and of course it doesn't. So why didn't they all just leave? I don't know. They stay there for some reason. But yeah, she goes to this hotel and she looks over these documents, but if it was, does the organization want her to know this stuff, or not want her to know this stuff?
Well,
I don't think they want her to know, because when she seals it up and gives it, she decides to, you know, she is deciding what she's going to do. She has all this money and whatnot. She stows most of the money in a locker somewhere, and gives some of the money and all the details
Right.
to Scat Blue. And he asked if she's looked at it, and she was able to seal it in a way, like you mentioned, Joe, that she said she didn't look at any of it. So they think that she isn't privy to any of the information. And we still as the reader don't know what it is, which is weird, since she's, the protagonist. We that's kept from the reader.
Yeah.
At that point.
And then, Prince Haka summons Scat and Fuzz Harrison and Uncle Kieran to that meeting at the palatial mansion in the mountains of San Bernardino, where he comes up with the plan where we'll destroy all the files except for Preacher Rail's file. And of course they think Toni hasn't read any of this, and that they'll reveal, and this is what does happen. Scat reveals to Toni the contents of Preacher Rail's file, which she's already read, and how this is going to be the pretext for them killing him off and making a martyr. So that's really the part that she's told by the org, even though she already knows all of it.
At this point, I guess I could share this at this point. We learned that he has cancer, which kind of fills, you mentioned his name having deeper meaning, besides just what's in his head and heart. He obviously has cancer, and he can't wither away, because that won't do the organization any good. And that's also why he's been, using heroin, because he's not getting medical help. And so they're going to have him assassinated and used as a martyr for the movement. And who's gonna do it?
Who would do it? Rob?
Yeah,
who,
I wonder
who could it be?
And of course we get in there, we get Scat regaling Toni with a great Ed Wood quote about the nature of life, which is, everything in life that's good is dirty, just like sex.
They try to make it. They try to make it dirty. They say doesn't he say something like they try to make it dirty? People are just having a pleasurable experience, and we make everything dirty. So, I guess this is, in a way, I don't think Ed was ever a neat or careful writer. I don't think you could ever call him that. But he does sort of, I guess, telegraph from the earliest passages of the book, Toni's training with the 22 caliber rifle, which I don't know how good or bad a 22 caliber rifle is. I don't know how powerful it is.
You can, lots of people get killed by 22s. It's not the caliber I'd be choosing to kill someone.
Right.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, that's a pretty small caliber, Joe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's 22, unless you hit the right spot. It's not.
Well, I looked into it, and I believe Malcolm X was killed with a shotgun. I believe that the guy got close enough to him to kill him with a shotgun.
A shotgun, and a whole lot of 9mm and 45mm rounds out of pistols too. Yeah.
Okay.
They were not. They were not going to let Malcolm X get up. Yeah, that's for sure.
So, I don't know much about, when I heard 22s. I just remember a Notorious B.I.G. song where he says he has 2 22s in his shoes. So,
and the it's literally, I think it's literally on page 1, but talking also immediately about shooting and 22s, and also there's the quote unquote, and it's never described as to what this means, but the quote unquote 22 club, is that what they're even referring to? I guess, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion in that first chapter about a Molotov cocktail versus a 22.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's the 22nd Street Club is what they call it.
22nd Street Club. Okay.
And I think there's a discussion of Molotov cocktails, and maybe the gasoline is difficult to get or something. Was there a reference to that?
Now the reason Ed might have been fixated on the 22 was, if we go back to his love of Westerns, one of the classic repeating rifles that Ed would have, the lever action repeating rifle that Ed would have known from the Westerns he loved, was a Henry 22 long rifle. So that may be his his fascination with the 22. I don't know, but
I
that's
think Kenny Duncan actually in trick shooting is shooting a Winchester 22, as a matter of fact.
okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Like I said, before I even dipped into the text of the novel at all, I read the front cover, back cover, all that stuff, which Rob very helpfully scanned as well. And I thought that, okay, she is going to be kind of an Avenger kind of figure, and that the 22 was just her weapon of choice, and it was going to be like the thing that she, and
like Ms.
but
45.
right, but she's not Ms. 22. I think she doesn't even use it, I think, until the end of the
Right.
she doesn't.
We just hear she's got all this training and everything, and is supposedly a crack shot, but
Well, I guess at the end there, she spends 2 weeks with Uncle Kieran,
yeah,
just refining honing her skills from when she was a teenager.
It's sort of
Right.
it's sort of a training montage,
Yeah.
I guess.
But
okay.
we should mention that if we want to go this far already, when she enters, I can't remember the venue specifically, but the arena, there we have a crowd. There's going to be a series of speakers. She goes in drag. She dresses as a man.
Okay. Well, that allowed. I thought, boy, it's not an Ed Wood book of this vintage if he doesn't mention Levi's, because Levi's are always a bad sign. If your character is wearing Levi's, ooh, So she's wearing Levi's, and he describes her as looking almost mannish in the outfit. She looks mannish in the outfit. So Levi's, I don't know what he had specifically against Levi's, but Levi's are never good in his stories or novels. And
Uncle Kieran at the beginning, like you mentioned, we don't learn for 10 pages is actually a woman, and she has denim trousers.
what? Okay, can somebody just tell me, just in general, like, okay, what is the timeline of Toni's life? Okay, she grew up on the plantation, and then her parents died, and then she was sent to Uncle Kieran
at the age of 13.
The age of 13. Why was she sent to Uncle Kieran?
I don't think.
And then Kieran, and then Kieran grooms her for Madame Rose, and then okay, so all right, none of that made sense to me. Like, why did she grow up like on the plantation and now she's living? What is Uncle Kieran's? It's not a school or something, but she has like lots of kids. Uncle Kieran has
it's a club. She's teaching them how to shoot, and then eventually these kids are going to these rallies.
I think it is kind of a school. At one point they mentioned these kids said between the ages of 13 and 15 are quote unquote sophomores. So it is kind of a school, but it's a school for militant members of kids growing up in the organization. They're going to be useful tools, obviously, for the organization.
And they all have Woodian names like Mary and Barbara.
Right.
just to throw in some more Wood.
It's clever. It's kind of clever because it's the first clue early on that Uncle Kieran is not a guy.
Right.
Where you're like, wait a minute. The people in the school here, they all have female names, and then it is subsequently very quickly revealed that I think the very first time we hear it mentioned that Uncle Kieran is a quote unquote Negro lesbian. Negro, which
okay, I think that was as close as Ed comes to trying to be politically correct. I think maybe that might have been the term of choice at that time. So one thing I saw in the promotional blurbs is that the word black was capitalized. And I thought, oh, okay, because that's something that we do now is the word black is capitalized. So I thought, is that going to carry over into the book? It doesn't. Yeah. But I think the word white is occasionally capitalized, but
it's capitalized a lot initially. Whitey is capitalized a lot initially, and then it sort of becomes erratic.
Well, Ed also does his random capitalization of words. He likes to have words random capitalized.
There's lots of it here, actually. Lots of, and we're not only talking about capitalizing the word, but the word is in all caps. Yeah.
But he holds off on his ellipses. I don't think his book was like heavy on the ellipses. Sometimes the ellipses get out of hand. Sometimes he makes a passage like almost impossible to read because you know, he has so many ellipses and random capitalizations and things like that. So that's why I would say that there was a few like little typos where like she doesn't know anything was like written as N-O rather than K-N-O-W. There was something like that. There was a few little typos because I think that these books were probably, you know, I don't think there was any editing that went into them. Do you think anybody at Private Editions was editing these manuscripts?
That's exactly what I wanted to table real quick, because he does actually have reasonably
Yeah,
robust sentence structures here, using semicolons grammatically and things of that nature. And
yeah.
we don't get just ellipses, which are, you know, pretty lazy way to just stitch everything together, quite honestly, from a writing standpoint. But it makes me wonder, it doesn't, I doubt it, right? It doesn't, why would, you know,
Yeah, they
private editions in their little office at Canoga Park, would they run this through, and why, right? Given the, you know,
Well,
the
and let's be real, you know, compared to like Charlene White, Ed was freaking Tolstoy, you
yeah,
know?
right.
Okay, I will just ask this question because I think it was intended as such. I don't know. In the liquor store robbery scene, which I think is one of the darker passages of the book, Ed gets about as graphic as he gets in the book. Was this for readers intended to be sort of a little like male power fantasy sequence? Do you think this was like because they describe, you know, they describe the woman's clothing, they describe the woman's body, like they describe it in a way that I think is meant to maybe be like a fantasy for guys in the audience. For I don't know. I mean, Ed wrote some pretty depraved stuff over the years, so
well, especially in the short stories. I think you know, at least that's my impression or opinion, is that, you know, his quote unquote worst, you know what I mean by transgressive, extreme stuff, is appearing in the short stories. And there's little outbreaks of that kind of stuff in some of his novels, like here.
Well, you know, he writes rape sequences so often into his film scripts and short stories that I have to think that on some level, like this appealed to him, or appealed to some part of his brain. I would always wonder, like of course, I had to spend a lot of time with the Apostolov movies. Like, why would these movies have like rape sequences in them? Like, why? You know, who is this for?
It was in almost everything back then, though. Real, I mean,
yeah.
You know, like
Well,
we have the joke about the, oh, well, you raped me. Yeah, well, when this started, I wasn't really in favor of it, but boy, I really got off. So thanks for raping me.
Yeah.
Routine, you know.
But you know, like, you know, in the Joe Robertson film, Mrs. Stone's Thing, like there's like a traumatic rape flashback scene, or like one of the characters like flashes back to having witnessed a rape as a child, and I had to wonder, like, God dang, like, why, like, if the purpose of that movie, I guess, is to be erotica, like, why are you putting this in? But I had to think that the scene in Toni Black Tigress is too detailed and it lingers for too long, because if you just wanted to say that, you know, these black characters are sexually assaulting this white woman, you could have just said like they, you know, they closed in around her and, you know,
right,
and then cut away to something else. But Ed doesn't. Ed stays in the scene. So I had to wonder, like, you know, maybe this to a certain segment of the audience. I don't know. He tries to write in all kinds of sexual scenarios into his books, and maybe you know, he wanted to write something like that into it. So I think it's, I don't know. It's presented as a horror story. It's presented as a very dark and negative moment, but he lingers on it for so long. I have to wonder if maybe in some very twisted way, it's not sort of a male power fantasy of being able to take advantage of this this woman. And that scene is set up in such a way where she and her husband run the liquor store, and the husband leaves, I guess, and says, "Oh, you'll be fine here on your own," or something like that. And I wondered, why doesn't this woman have a gun? Wouldn't she just have like a gun like under the counter? But she doesn't at all. So I don't, that was, I think, maybe the darkest and ugliest passage of this, but so I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you think was happening there?
Well, it's clearly the dark. You said maybe it was. I think it was clearly the darkest part of the book by a long way. Even the earlier scene at the start of the riot where a father kills his 3 children to make it look like the police did it. That's a very quick that's a very quick part of the book that's not lingered on. It's really just a statement of fact of what he does, unlike the later rape and killing of the woman at the liquor store, which goes on for a while and is much more descriptive. So,
since none of the characters in this scene are characters that we follow through the book, he could have just skipped this scene entirely. There's none of the main characters in the book are in it at all. It doesn't have any.
It's giving a tenor to the whole. It's giving a tenor to the whole riot. It's really Ed.
Yeah.
Because it's characterized by really those 2 incidents, and then the burning of a lot of the city and the looting. Those
Yeah.
As far as what was his motivation in going into that one scene in such detail?
I don't know. It just felt like he was wallowing in it unnecessarily. It was like, why are you sticking with this scene for so long, Ed? Why? I don't know.
But I don't know if it's just that, if you read other things, even, there's every 10 pages, something's happening when it's an adult paperback. But a lot of times Ed sometimes like the Watts books, there's very little, and it just kind of goes into flashbacks, and it almost uses a framing thing. But in this, it's almost like there's like 3 scenes, and then we're getting towards the end of the book, and it was just like, it's almost like, I think it does fulfill a purpose, but it is kind of filler to, contractually fulfill, because I don't know. But I agree. That was very disturbing and went on far too long.
Well,
edited down.
I had to appreciate the relationship in Watts the Difference, because it's a consensual relationship, and Rocky and Angie actually enjoy being with each other and spending time with each other. Technically, as I said to Greg, the plot of that book technically is just that Rocky and Angie spend a weekend together and flash back to different things in their life. That's all that really happens in that book. And it was nice that for one book, they have this nice relationship where there's nothing cruel about it. They are equals in the relationship. They don't try to abuse each other. One thing we haven't even talked about is we've talked about Toni's sexual initiation at the hands of a preacher Rail, but we haven't talked about her previous sexual experiences to that, which is another horrifying detail that Ed just mentions as if it's nothing. Like her actual sexual initiation came at the hands of being, I believe, raped repeatedly, like like the guys are like taking turns taking her into an alley or something like that. And Ed just,
anytime there's an alley in an Ed Wood, you want to cover your face.
Yeah, alleys are always bad.
Well, and that's what Madame Rose refers to when she says, well, do you think that was just happenstance, or how do you know that wasn't part of the organization's plan to get you ready for your role as org whore. She doesn't say it that way, but
No, but yeah, I was just like, oh wow, what a thing to add to what a thing to add to this already very disturbing novel. So yeah, it was just a dark detail that barely gets any attention. I don't think there's any sense that like Toni is traumatized by this, or that she has like PTSD from it. I would think that certainly by her experiences by the end of this book, that Toni probably would be traumatized and probably would have PTSD. Do you think, by the way, they left it open enough that there could have been a Toni Black Tigress 2? Do you think they leave it open enough, not without spoiling too much? Do you think that they leave it open enough where there could have been a follow-up to this book?
Only that the organization persists.
Okay, well then
you'd have to have a new framework around that.
I mean, there's a suggested action that's ordered at the end of the book, but it's sort of like the movie that ends with a character going out and exiting a building. Well, you don't really know what happened for sure to the character, right? It could be this or that.
We know. I mean, we don't kid ourselves here. We know what's going to happen. But
let's go ahead and take ourselves there, because I think we're
just
gone
before
past
we get
the 2
to that.
hour
Just
mark.
before that, though, I just wanted to say that I was glad to see that Ed worked in at least one octopus reference in the book, because I'm always looking for Dr. Vornoff's octopus. And right near the end of the book, he makes the Toni's. It's Toni's internal thought of, she was part of the organization, no longer an entity all by herself to do only as she wanted. She was one of the tentacles of the octopus. So I always look for Dr. Vornoff's octopus.
So basically we got Toni. She, in order to do the hit on Reverend Rail, she wants not just money, she wants a seat at the table.
Yep.
And it's kind of weird because it sounds like it's given to her, but later she has a conversation with somebody about it later, which it's kind of goofy. But basically, it's like she makes this hit, and she's gonna she's going to be rich and powerful in the organization, and she assassinates Reverend Rail, and there's chaos, and there's Molotov cocktails flying everywhere. There's madness. And she escapes, and we assume she's going to, be a seat at this table. But we also know that everybody at that table, they know all these horrible things about them to keep them contributing money. And I don't know if we just want to say what happens. What happens after the hit is done?
Before we even get there, does she change out of her male clothes back into female clothes, like in the midst of all this like chaos? How the hell does she do that?
I don't know how you have a dress under trousers, but
yes. So I was like, what? That was one place. That was the one place where the believability of this novel slipped just ever so slightly.
Superman. Yeah.
It was like, well, yeah, it was like a Superman thing, but it's like reverse Superman, I guess. I don't know. But
Scat offers her, right? Scat offers her a new pathway. You're going to be my whore, but it's not going to be exclusive. I get to fuck whoever I want. And, but you'll live a good life. But she's not happy with that, right? And so she's now being seen as a liability because she's thinking that she's got some power and ability to wrap some folks around her finger. So,
well, the way the ending, I guess, disappointed me was even toward the end, I still had the title of the book in my mind, Toni Black Tigress. And I thought, okay, we're going to have a warrior goddess here. She's not a tigress. She's not going to go out like a tigress would go out.
She's rabble.
Yeah, she's just a rabble. Boy, there's two words that Ed loves in this book. He gets stuck on words. Obviously, rabble, which comes up. The other one is jouncing. He keeps talking about jouncing. And I was like, what the? what the heck is jouncing? Jouncing is just bouncing. It's just another word for, because Ed loves bouncing, and he loves bouncing asses. I don't know. That's like a big motif in his writing. So that must have been, see, that's one of those things where it's like, it's too specific, where like we've gone past just writing pornography for the world, and it's writing pornography for himself. So obviously bouncing is like a thing that's in Ed's mind as being sexy. So bouncing is to him sexy, but he hit on this word jouncing, and so jouncing becomes one of the words that he gets stuck on. But even towards the end, I was thinking, like, how is she Toni Black Tigress? She's not she does this one thing. It's not like she's out there in, when the riot is going on, she hides, she takes the money and runs. So that's not a tigress. So even toward the end, I'm thinking, all right, now finally, however many, I don't know, this book isn't long, but was 150 pages or something like that. Ed is finally going to give us the black tigress that he promised us on the cover of this book. And then I get to the ending, I'm like, that's okay. That's a very cynical and bleak ending for this book, because I think this was written when Ed was in a very cynical and bleak mood. But it wasn't what I was hoping for Toni, because I keep, like I said, I keep hoping for her to turn into Pam Grier, but that's not what this book is.
Well,
So,
welcome to the world of sleaze novels, right? It's not unusual for the cover imagery and the blurbs to be rather unrelated to the content that you eventually end up reading. It's sort of like the crappy steak that's being sold with this tantalizing sizzle.
well, do you think this book almost could have been marketed to Black readers? I mean, like, they might have picked up a novel called Toni Black Tigress and read, she's got this 22 and blah, blah, blah. And then what on earth would they have thought of this book by the time they got into it? So
yeah, I totally agreed. That would be traumatic.
You could well see somebody coming up with that idea, right? Like, hey, there's this market out there we're not tapping. So, and the title could have existed before Ed wrote a word,
Yeah, it could be that the title. Well, the first thought when I saw the title, besides Toni the Tiger from Frosted Flakes, was one of the Ilsa movies has the word tigress in it. I think she's like
Tigress of Siberia.
Tigress of Siberia.
Oh, there wasn't.
Yeah, she's the Ilsa the Tigress of Siberia. So she went from being.
I didn't get that deep enough into that series.
She went from being a wolf to being a. She went from being a wolf to being a tiger, and then in one she's just harem keeper of the oil sheiks.
Yeah,
and one of the guys in that is actually in one of the Apostolov movies. So Max Thayer or something, I think his name is. At least Ilsa is not an admirable character in any sense, but she does live up to the wolf part and the tigress part of her name. She's very take charge. She's very violent. She's not afraid to get in there and mix it up. And she's not like taking the satchel of money and documents and hiding in a hotel. Like, so even toward the end, like I said, I kept hoping. I was like, all right, now we're going to get the badass black heroine. We get heroin in this book, but not the kind of heroin that I was hoping for. But no, Ed is like, no, this is, it's almost like presaging sort of the cynicism of the 1970s, like where this character is going to end up, I remember on Family Guy, there's this sketch where there's this, they see this guy who's a lawyer in a library, and he's found he's found the case, that he's found the case law that he wants, and now he's going to win his case. And they're watching him do all this in a montage, and he exits the library and he's immediately gunned down by a sniper. they said, oh, he was in a 70s movie the whole time. So so that's the cynicism here. I kept thinking, okay, Tony's paid her dues time after time, but no, it's not that kind of book.
No Wizard of Oz ending for you, buddy.
No.
You get the Looking for Mr. Goodbar ending.
Yeah. I haven't watched that movie in a long time. I haven't watched Looking for Mr.
There's
Goodbar.
a depressing movie for you.
Yeah. But if you really want to, I wonder what Ed would have thought of that movie. I'm sure.
Is it Richard Gere and Looking
Yeah.
for Mr. Gere?
Yeah.
Right. This of course, Toni Black Tigress, although she's a prostitute, it's not Pretty Woman, right? The guys she's dealing with are not Richard Gere. Going back to Ilsa Tigress of Siberia, there's a great scene in that movie. It jumped into my head immediately, where Ilsa, they're on a large sheet of ice and with some of the soldiers and things, and there's some guy that she wants to, some underling she wants to take out. Oh, I'm paraphrasing, by the way. Oh, you have a little bit of a fever, we'll cool you down. And they dunk him under the ice with like some big, he's tied to ropes and shit like that, and he goes under the ice, and then they're winding it, and they pull him up on the other side, and of course by that point he's dead. But I would highly recommend all the Ilsa films, as a matter of fact, are highly recommended.
Yeah.
That almost sounds like a scene out of The Abominable Dr. Phibes with Vincent Price, that kind of, well, that's the kind of Baroque way of killing someone,
Well, in a way, though, I mean, Phibes is sort of a sympathetic character, and I guess there's a real sympathy behind what Phibes does in his movies, because he has a real love of his late wife,
right.
And so there is some. Those films, I mean, aren't as depressing or anything. They're not depressing at all, because you don't feel bad for the people who die at all, and you're kind of, in a weird way, rooting for Phibes to kill more people. Like, that's the whole point of those.
It's one of those, right? One of the rare movies where you're just like, you're the guy. Yeah.
Rooting for him, and he gets away with everything in those movies, and you wouldn't want it another way. You don't want Phibes to be caught, or you don't want Phibes to be killed or something.
This is the 1970s, of course, but back in the day, of course, Bowling for Dollars would be on like at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there would be like a theme for the whole entire. This week it's Vincent Price week, and it'd be an Abominable Doctor at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Well, that just about that film, the one thing that really shocked me is that and that more directors should do, and more filmmakers and film writers should do, is that one character is killed in a scene that you think is just going to be pure exposition. You think it's like, oh, they're investigating a crime scene and blah, blah, blah. It's just going to be people talking, and boom, character killed. And you're like, oh, okay, now you're not safe anywhere. We're not safe at any point in this movie. People can always die. But one thing that you don't get in Toni Black Tigress is the feel of like, of I don't know, of day-to-day life, of what her days are really like. There's not really a lot of texture to her days. It kind of just goes from event to event. I don't know.
Who would play? We talked earlier. Could this be made into a movie? It would be. I could see
casting Toni Black.
Yeah, let's cast Toni. So I could see.
Toni.
I could see Quentin Tarantino doing a pretty good job with something like this. Of course, we get the explosions of Angora, and we haven't. We mentioned it, but there are explosions of Angora where it's everything. It's the carpet, the shoe. It's not merely just Angora dress, but we also get lots of marabou. We get lots. We mentioned this, lots of negligee, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's also this larger scale Black Power organization that is fighting a political battle across the whole entire country and trying to infiltrate.
I just want to add that if somebody is interested in the gender and sexuality of Ed Wood, the chapters about Scat Blue, I should say his fantasies too, because you mentioned everything is white fur in his pad, but there's there's whole monologues about what it is to be a man that cross dresses, and there's the mirrors, how he looks in the mirror.
Yeah,
himself with the woman in
Oh.
the background, et cetera, et
You,
cetera.
you
Anyway,
get that
that's
whole Glenn or Glenda voice coming back in
Right.
again.
Well,
Exactly.
mirrors are a big motif in Ed's work, and I think one of Toni's dreams is to have a place where the ceiling is a mirror, like a mirror ceiling is one of her goals. Like, oh, I'm not going to have just a regular ceiling; I'm going to have a mirror ceiling, which you don't see that much anymore. But that was kind of a thing in the 70s. You know, in the 60s and 70s, having those mirrored ceilings.
Over your waterbed, you know.
You know, you would have so you could look up and see yourself, I guess. I think people got over that because they were like, you probably would wake up some morning and see something you wouldn't want to see. You'd say, oh God.
Well, I think once the Betamax and other video cameras came in, you didn't need the mirrored
Yeah.
ceiling. You could just make video of yourself in action.
Yeah. So
A la American Psycho, you know, that wonderful scene.
yeah.
Christian
Yeah.
Bale having
Yeah,
sex with these hookers, but he's just looking at himself.
Yeah.
You know,
So-
he's you know, flexing and just concerned about his own.
So I just wanted to break the tension for the viewer to just basically say Prince Haka has scablued to put a hit on our
yeah.
protagonist, and
Yeah.
she goes off a cliff. He's told to burn all of her stuff, and the novel ends, burn baby burn,
Yeah.
which is the back.
Right.
Okay.
What's the difference?
Well, then, it was also, I guess that book was also known, but it was also, of course, a slogan of the Black Power movement in the 1960s. And this is Ed's most cynical possible take on that phrase. And I think when we did the first Watts novel, I think I included this sermon by Adam Clayton Powell, I think something like that. Where he was talking about burn, baby, burn. Don't just burn, baby, burn. He would say, learn, baby, learn, and earn, baby, earn. And he was trying to put a positive spin on. Well, this is Ed's at his most negative. So I think, though, Toni she could jump out of the car. She could do something. You know, she's a tigress.
Hanging on the cliff?
Well, yeah, they don't actually. They just say that they're going to do it, and you just think, it's like, oh, okay, that's what's going to happen to Toni. But it doesn't have to. Toni is resourceful. She's survived some bad stuff up to there, you know.
So the fulfillment of where you wanted her to go is in the sequel.
Exactly, where she gets, I don't know, she does something. She becomes sort
revenge. She's hanging off the cliff. She's going to get revenge on the organization.
Literally cliffhanging. But who would play her in a movie? Who would play her in a movie? Right.
Well, I'm going to throw out Samuel L. Jackson for Prince Haka.
Okay.
Ooh, that's good.
A movie today or a movie like 50 or 60 years ago?
We're doing it today, Joe. Come on.
Oh, we're doing it today. Okay.
Yeah.
He says, because you said Quentin Tarantino. If I was putting Tarantino onto one of Ed's unfilmed novels that hadn't been adapted yet, Toni Black Tigress would be about like the 18th or 19th or 20th or 30th book. I would say give him like Security Risk or something, you know. I would say put him on to, like, heck, even put him on Watts the Difference or Watts After. But no,
it'd be a trilogy. It'd be like Lord of the Rings, the Watts trilogy.
Well, I would put him on, you know, I would have steered him towards Security Risk. Like Security Risk, he could have some fun with that one. But I would have to know, like, who is like a very popular young Black actress today, Zendaya or something, you know. You would have to be somebody like that, you know. But would they even want to be anywhere near this book?
Torpedo her career potentially.
Right,
yeah, exactly. So I was going to say, like, it's probably better that this one doesn't get republished, that this one doesn't go back into circulation. I'm going to say that Toni Black Tigress should probably remain in the Stanford archives. You know,
I think it's thumbs down there.
No, I don't. It was a worthwhile reading experience, but this is one of those ones where you said it was in the Stanford archives.
That was another
Oh,
book.
another book. Okay,
Yeah.
but it's in the archives of some place. One of the colleges has like all of Ed's.
I don't know if Cornell has this one or not.
Cornell.
Yeah.
This one should remain in the archives. If Ed Wood fans want to go out and seek it out, they should be able to find it somewhere. But it almost feels like it would, even to publish this as an ebook or something, it almost feels like weird to like make money off of it, or to have, you know, any kind of, even if you're making 99 cents off of it or something. It would feel weird to do that. Because
I mean, when people have trouble with Mark Twain, you can't have this. I know reading this, you know, I had, you know, I've spent the last year taking all this DEEB training, they call it, diversity, equality, inclusion, and I'm forgetting the B, belonging. And so of course I'm like reading this, I'm just like, oh, this is, you know, so and today all these things in the news, I think it's one of the sportscasters for the A's just got suspended because he accidentally misspoke when he talked about a historical baseball league. He made allegedly a racial slur, and now he's suspended. Wow. And also today there was a task force that in California that is decided about reparations for slavery in California. And I'm just trying to, you know, read it. We've come 53 years from this book, and just where we are now. We had George Floyd riots a couple of years ago. I just kind of was when, you know, I had a little creepy feeling reading this one and discussing it. But so I just kind of wanted to put that framework on. Here we are, 4 white guys. I just wanted to just say we have a deeper understanding, but we're interested in this author, and it's a rare book. We had a chance to read and discuss.
Read it.
But it should not. No one should read this. I think
other than
we address this. We have fun, but we are coming to it academically, and we're coming at it literarily, if that's a word.
Right.
And I just wanted to give it a little framework, just because it's kind of a hot topic. You know, it's a very transgressive book, and it should never be republished.
Right.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Well, not only about matters of race, but also matters of gender, obviously. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, I try to never use myself as a yardstick for anything, because I'm not bothered by anything. I read, you know, I've got so much great stuff I could loan to you, Joe, to give you nightmares. It's not even funny. But that being said, you know, something like publishing Toni Black TIGRESS nowadays, you know, at a minimum, you'd have to have some sort of introduction.
Yeah.
Just so people know what they're getting into before they get any farther into it. And then certainly it would just be up to whoever's doing it, whether they wanted to actually go so far as to even have something like footnoting throughout it.
Yeah.
About various things that are brought up. But, you know, again, all these books and a lot of stuff up through the mid 80s came out at a very different time. And it wasn't to a quote unquote, a public marketplace, especially a lot of the stuff in the 70s and the 80s. Those were being sold at adult bookstores. So it's not like it was being sold in drugstores, where a much broader segment of the population would have seen it then. And even then probably, and even then certainly would have been disturbed by a bunch of it, you know? So
it's funny you mentioned footnoting, because that's what I kept thinking as I was reading this book was, you know, there's real historical events that were happening that are the backdrop of this book. And I kind of almost wish that had been an annotated version of this with footnotes along the sides and the margins and stuff like that. So, I also thought of a footnoted edition of this book, an annotated version of Toni Black TIGRESS. And maybe, you know, people have talked about Song of the South, if it could ever be re-released. And people have said, well, maybe if you put like a disclaimer in front of it, or if you put maybe like, you know, so in an introductory segment in front of it. And maybe this book and the two Watts novels could be published in some sort of like, omnibus edition, but with lots of with the warnings, and of course there should be Black people who comment on this. Although that makes it so awkward, because I don't know if I would be comfortable asking a Black person to read this, like, unless they were like a huge Ed Wood fan and wanted to delve into this, because, like, I don't know, do you really, for this obscure 1960s paperback, do you really want to, like, lower yourself into the hell that Ed Wood describes in this book? So do you really want? Go ahead.
I remember, Joe, I had when I was a kid growing up, and it was one of my prized possessions, and I read the books many times over. When I was a little kid, it was in a slipcover, the whole entire Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the whole entire C.S. Lewis series. Could we do the Watts books? Young, Gay, and Black? We could throw in Black Myth.
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
Sure.
It could happen. It shouldn't happen, but
yeah,
right.
But with disclaimers and footnotes and all kinds of things. The thing is, I also thought that I've seen the cover of this book. I don't know that the cover would necessarily jump out at you if you were at a adult paperback.
No, it's very plain, right?
Yeah, it was not a hard sell at all. As far as the footnoting goes, it's interesting that as descriptive as Ed was in parts of the book, in Toni's first sexual encounter with Scat, he makes this elliptical reference to her performing the illegal sex act on him. And that's, of course, a reference to oral sex, which was illegal still in California at that time, right? That's prime for a footnote right there, because somebody reading that would be like, the illegal sex act, what's that?
Well, that
good.
That comes up a lot in Ed's writing, whether performing oral sex, even if it's in a heterosexual relationship, would be considered a homosexual act. By the way, I was trying to find the cover. I was trying to Google image search the cover of Toni Black Tigress, and I just took the, not in quotes, the phrase Toni Black Tigress, and one of the first things that comes up is a picture of Toni the Tiger as a female. And it seems to be like erotic Toni the Tiger fan art. So if you look up Toni the Tigress,
that's a community I was not aware of.
And somehow it fits here. It fits here perfectly. That's probably the redeeming quality of this book is trying to get in to the understanding of this man, the author, and his cross-dressing and his sexuality. That's probably the most redeeming quality about the book, is that all being discussed. But that's all I have. Other than that, I enjoyed So What, Fluff.
Yeah, So What is in the book.
Muddle Her Mind. There's a lot of with language in there.
Yep, there's a mind muddling. There's a So What. I think we get a So What pretty early in the book, and I was like, oh wow, he's checking off all the boxes. That's why I say, like, if you're the kind of person who just likes the cadence of Ed's writing, and you like his writing style, and you like the vocabulary words or the pet phrases that he uses, you're going to find a lot to enjoy in. And he will have these like really convoluted sentences where I don't know how he gets from one end of the sentence to the other. And if you want that stuff, and people do want to read Ed's stuff for the weirdness of his writing style, you'll get it in Toni Black Tigress. But my point is that you can get all the tropes and things of Ed's writing in stuff that won't make you question humanity, and won't make you say, like, oh my God, what are we doing in studying this man and his work for years? Why are we doing this? Because I would say, again, read Death of a Transvestite, read Security Risk, read Carnival Peace. If you are like Preacher Rail, a junkie, and you need your fix, you get to Toni Black Tigress. That's when you're on the hard stuff. When you get down to these books. It's not the ugly. I shouldn't say that it's the ugliest or meanest thing that he ever wrote, but in there. It's so if there were glimpses of hope that I found, or glimpses of sympathy that I found in the Watts, the first two Watts novels, and I'm almost willing to say that this is a third, sort of a quasi sequel because of the organization and calling it The Organization. They're gone by Toni Black Tigress. So the other thing I will say about the book is that it's, despite the dark content, it is a relatively quick and painless read. It breezes by, is relatively coherent. I will also go on record, though, again, as saying I usually prefer the short stories to the novels, because Ed is better at sticking to a story for, like, 7 or 8 pages than he is for 150 pages. So
Yeah.
that's my other feeling about it. But
That's a good segue into, kind of tying a bow on this conversation. So I personally feel, yeah, to your point, Joe, I think this is sort of like the serious hardcore Ed Wood aficionado may get a lot out of this. Everybody else might be left scratching their head quite a bit. I actually think this is it's a perhaps inflammatory statement. I think it's one of my it's become one of my favorite Ed Wood paperbacks, and because of, and I'd like to see what Jim thinks about this, because of the quote unquote degree of woodiness, if that makes sense. It's very satisfying to me as an Ed Wood fan to have this high degree of woodiness.
Yeah, that's the enjoyment I got out of the book, was finding these little nuggets scattered throughout, and some of the weird resonances, like I said, that I could see in the book to other topics and things. And like I said, it's made me think now I really need to go back and revisit his other novels, with a much more analytical eye, after so many years.
Right on. All right, so this was good, guys. Rob, anything you wanted to add before I kind of wrap it?
No, not one of my favorites. But I would agree with you that it's a smorgasbord of woodiness. It's all in there.
Yeah. So again, I hope for all of you who have slugged through the last 2.5+ hours, you found this worth your while, found it entertaining, and more importantly, we jest about what we recognize certainly as very sensitive topics, and we don't mean to besmirch the seriousness of the topics therein. We're just trying to cover the ground on Ed Wood's Toni Black Tigress. So I just want to wrap it by saying I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I certainly am real grateful for these guys joining me here today and bringing so much to the table. I learned a lot in the last 2.5 hours, and a lot of things that I hadn't thought about previously. So I hope you again found this fun. Hope you found it in some way perhaps beneficial, and I hope you'll join us back here again at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Thanks, everybody.